Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to this digital conversation here at ORF. I am Nagma. We continue to have meaningful conversations here at ORF online during this lockdown and when the world is coming out of the lockdown. This conversation today, we are having this conversation today at a time when finally, after all the postponement, India and Australia are going to have a summit meeting virtually. So this makes it a very interesting time to talk about also the bilateral ties. During this conversation today, we are going to look at what can we expect out of this virtual summit. Along with this, can we expect a greater cooperation between India and Australia? And as a result, can we look at a stronger and a more stable Indo-Pacific? Joining me today on this conversation are two very eminent speakers. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Michael Fullilove and Ambassador Navdeep Suri. And thank you, all of you, a very big thanks to all of you who are joining us today in this conversation. So Dr. Michael Fullilove is the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. He serves on the Advisory Council of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And he's also been an advisor to PM Paul Keating. Dr. Fullilove writes widely on Australian, American foreign policy, and on global issues in very esteemed publications, including the New York Times and Financial Times. And along with all of that, he's a much sought after speaker and commentator. So a very warm welcome to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Nagma.
And Dr. Fullilove, we will be starting this conversation, but let me introduce you to my second speaker, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, who's a career diplomat. He's also the director of the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at ORF. But most importantly, for India and Australia, he's served as our High Commissioner to Australia. And we look forward to his very valuable inputs on bilateral ties. So, Michael, I want to begin with you, and let me begin by drawing your attention to the comment that came from President Trump recently, and the world now is discussing that. He said that the G7 does not represent any longer what's going on in the world, and he proposes to call it either the G10 or the G11, and he's invited India and Australia to be part of the grouping. So this is pretty significant. And does this signify or point towards the global shift that we are witnessing in the post-COVID world? Your comments on this?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here with an old friend, Navdeep, and with you, Nagma, and all my friends at ORF and in India. So thank you very much for having me. It's a very interesting call from President Trump. I think all of us accept that the institutions of international order are out of date and they need updating. This is an interesting suggestion. The logic of it is not entirely clear to me. It depends on what this organisation should be. For example, if it should be the International Steering Committee for the Global Economy, then it's strange that President Trump doesn't want China involved. On the other hand, if he wants this new organisation to have a democratic component, then it's odd that he's inviting Russia. So I'm not sure how coherent the proposal is. I think we have to beware because everything that President Trump, many things that President Trump touch turn to mud. So we need to be careful about that. On the other hand, speaking from a selfish Australian point of view, it's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity based on the relationship, I'm sure, between Prime Minister Morrison and President Trump. It's based on a perception, perhaps, that Australia's done reasonably well in responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, we were on the front foot in leading the discussions at the World Health Assembly into an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. So it may be that there's a sense that Australia has something to offer. As an Australian, I believe that's the case. And so I think we should jump on the opportunity and take yes for an answer. But I must say, the origins of the proposal, the fact that it comes from President Trump, who is flailing around in the pre-election period and looking for a way to win the election, and he may think that that dumping on China is the way to do it. I think we have to bear that in mind when we consider the proposal.
Very well. Ambassador Suri, would you like to join in with your comments on that? How do you see this proposal? It's an opportunity that we should jump at, or do you also connect it to the American elections? How do you look at this?
Well, there's a saying, don't look at a gift horse in the mouth. Actually a more perhaps coherent proposal came out of London also about this idea of a D10, of a group of the 10 large democracies, which also included both India and Australia. And I think there is something to reflect on that aspect as well. Look, again, from an Indian perspective, I strongly believe that there is a need to reshuffle the international order and really get past the post-1945 architecture. In the case of G7, again, it's pretty dated and it was in response to a particular crisis at a particular point of time. I would only say that any initiatives, whether coming out of London or Washington or Canberra or elsewhere, that look at bringing India into the mainstream of international dialogues, into the conversations where we are part of the rule-making processes rather than simply being rule takers, would be a force of good, not just for India, but for the international community as a whole. So without reflecting on the specific merits of President Trump's proposal, I think the larger debate that it initiates is a debate well worth having.
Sure. Let me bring you back to the Indo-Pacific, Michael, and I would like to look at, the political and security structure of the Indo-Pacific. How is it changing? Do you see the coming together of the middle power with, if I may say, the missing leadership of America that we've seen during the COVID times? And also, we've seen the growing unease of countries with China. So do you see a coming together of the middle powers in this area and the political and security structure of the Indo-Pacific in the post-COVID times? How do you look at that?
Yeah, well, I think a country like Australia finds itself in a discombobulating situation because we're faced with an administration in Washington that is increasingly feckless and an administration in Beijing that's increasingly reckless. And that's difficult for a country like Australia that has a very long-standing security alliance with the United States, as Navdeep knows from his time as High Commissioner, and the alliance is really baked into our national psychology. But we're in a moment where the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, doesn't believe in the free world and doesn't want to lead it. So that's complicated. And then on the other hand, we have China, which is Australia's most important economic partner, our leading trading partner, is obviously behaving in ways that make Australians very uneasy. Now, does that mean that the time for middle powers has come? And I wouldn't be so cheeky as to put Australia on the same level as India there, but I do think there is an opportunity for like-minded countries, for democracies like Australia and India, I beg your pardon, but not just democracies, also other significant Asian states in the region, to see if we can thicken our connections to each other, to see if there's more areas where our interests overlap, to do more in an informal way. I don't see big changes in the architecture at the moment. We see the Quad, of course, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But I think more important are the patterns of our interaction, the way our minds work. In Australia for a long time, we have shrunk Asia to the dimensions of China. And when the public has, in the last 10 years or so, because the economic connection with China has been so strong, when the public has thought about Asia and when government has talked about Asia, they've sort of meant China. And there have been a few of us who are saying, don't shrink Asia to the dimensions of China. It's important to remember there are half a dozen big states in Asia, India first among them, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia. All of us have our own ambitions. None of us wants to live in the shade of another country. All of us want elbow room and space to make our own future. And the more that countries like Australia and India can do with each other along those lines, I think the better it is for all of us and for the strategic order in the region.
Yeah, Michael, you say that when we were talking of Asia, we were basically looking at China. Is that changing now? And a very quick sub-question to that, does this give an opportunity, like you were just mentioning, to many other countries in the region, the Southeast Asian countries, to come together and to make a stronger coalition to join in the Quad Plus?
Well, on the first question, look, there's a real hardening of Australian opinion on China. And I'll give you one data point. In last year's Lowy Institute poll, trust in China fell by 20% in a single year, from 52% to 32%. And we'll release the next Lowy Institute poll later this month. And I can't imagine those numbers will have improved after the difficulties in the bilateral relationship in the last month or two. So yes, I think the debate, there's increasing unease in Australia, and therefore a desire as much as we can to diversify our political relations as well as our economic relations. Now that's hard. That's not an easy thing to do, especially on the economic side, but it's an important thing. In terms of Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asian countries have, all of them are different. All of them have different interests. It depends, I suppose, on how we conceive of the Quad. If we think of the Quad as a useful forum for dialogue, for discussion, for coordination, then yes, I think there are opportunities to bring some significant Southeast Asian countries into the fold over time. But I don't think we should rush it.
Right. All right. Ambassador Suri, I would like to bring you in here and your views, first of all, on the Quad Plus, will it be more effective? And secondly, when Michael was talking about China, and we've seen that Australia has taken the lead in pushing the case to investigate the origin of COVID. And as a result, Australia has also faced a lot of economic repercussions from China, looking at the economy. And these are very difficult times for Australia, which is also facing, like many other countries, unemployment and underemployment. But nevertheless, it took a stand. How do you see this? This is the new trend.
Well, I want to start by complimenting Australia for actually demonstrating a lot of resolve in responding to some pretty egregious acts by China. And the kind of language that I saw emanating out of the Chinese embassy in Canberra is quite unprecedented in modern and diplomacy, for a spokesperson or for an ambassador to use that kind of a rhetoric against a host country in which he's based in a non-war situation really is quite extraordinary. And I think, I'm familiar with the high stakes which are at play. China is Australia's largest export market. I think 38% of Australian exports go to China. So the stakes are very large. But yet for Prime Minister Morrison to say that we don't trade our values, I think was a very strong, significant statement that came out about this particular subject. The defensive mechanisms that Australia has had to put in place to protect its open society and to protect its democratic framework against some of the intrusions that we've seen into university campuses, into trying to corrupt political institutions, trying to, use the Chinese community, which has a noble track record in Australia as a Trojan horse, were really issues beyond the pale. So I think, Australia has done well to take a stand. Where the middle powers or other countries come in is that several other countries find themselves similarly at the receiving end of this Chinese behavior that we are beginning to see. And China has taken this sort of rifle shot approach of picking each target and saying, I'll deal with you individually. So Philippines can go to the International Council of Arbitration, win an award, and still not get anything at all in return. Vietnam can find its fishing boats being attacked and not be able to do anything alone. But I think together, we can get some kind of a resolve to take a firmer approach. So while the Quad itself may be nascent, but the fact that countries like India and China and Australia are having the 2+2 dialogue at the level of Foreign Secretary and Defense Secretary together is a sign of progress. The fact that we are having extensive bilateral naval exercises and looking at compatibility of systems and all of that is a sign of progress. Early days, but I think we need to build on the momentum that we have. And I think if there's one strong driver to it, it's the manner in which the Chinese have acted in the last couple of years.
So that could be a driver, and you think that there could be closer cooperation, or the need of the hour is a closer cooperation between these countries, and the Quad Plus could be more effective. Michael, given that Australia, like many other countries, is trying to reduce its dependence on China and the supply chain, the world finally was leading to China, and most of the countries are trying to cut down on that. What are the other countries that can take China's place for the economic ties? Basically, what are the other options, given that there was a lot of dependence on China? And where does India figure in this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to Navdeep for complimenting Australia, which I'll take. It has been interesting to see the undiplomatic behaviour that I know that the Indian High Commission would never engage in. I did think to myself once or twice over the last month or 6 weeks, what would happen if an Australian ambassador or an Australian consul general were to front up to ministerial press conferences in China unannounced, or threaten consumer boycotts against China? I'm sure they would be persona non grata out of there very quickly indeed. But anyway, the same standards don't seem to apply to every country. In terms of your question about diversification, there's been a lot of discussion, and it's really, I mean, both COVID, which self-disrupted a lot of supply chains and made it difficult to get things in Australia that we depend on, and then the behaviour of the Chinese and the sort of rhetorical attempts anyway at economic coercion, I think that is changing minds in the business world. And I think companies are starting to look at, they are starting to accept that there's a particular risk premium in doing business with China. And that's a very real factor. Now, having said that, diversification is easy to say and hard to do. And it's a matter of economics. At the moment, there's more demand for the commodities that we produce out of China than there are from other markets. So I think we've got to be realistic about it. It's easy for think tankers and strategists to say that business people are being greedy and they need to lift their eyes and look at the broader picture. It's harder for them to do. It won't be easy, as Navdeep said in relation to the Quad. It's going to take time. But I think over time, increasingly, especially if there's more fluctuation, if China has more disputes with its trading partners and its neighbours, if there's more turbulence in the China-Australia relationship, if Chinese suppliers start to, or Chinese customers start to look askance at Australia, then I think you will see movement. In terms of India, I like to be optimistic about these things. As Navdeep knows, a couple of years ago, Peter Varghese, our former distinguished High Commissioner in Delhi, and our head of our chief intelligence official and former head of our foreign affairs, wrote a terrific report on the Australia-India economic relationship. It had a lot of good suggestions in there about where the relationship should go, and I think we should press on with that. I mean, there's a lot of other business that we need to deal with, but I think over time we need to thicken our relationship with this very relatively fast-growing large economy.
Absolutely. Before I talk about the bilateral relationship and the summit that we are so looking forward to, I would like to go back to America. And we've been talking during this COVID time how the American leadership has been in a way missing, and China is trying to get in wherever America was missing. And we've seen that the situation in America has been very chaotic. As we are talking, America is very tense with Black Lives Matter. And everything that's happening there is somehow, we're looking at the elections as well. So there is a correlation between what is happening. How do you look at, in a way, Michael, the absence of American leadership, America going inwards and kind of becoming more and more protectionist, which has been President Trump's approach? And when you also look at the election that is going to face soon?
Well, it's a very tough thing for someone like me because I'm an Americanist and an Americophile. And I wrote a book on how America emerged from the Second World War as the leader of the world. And it does feel like the end of an era in a way. Now, it's important not to count the Americans out because, as you say, the United States is a democracy, unlike China. And there's an election in November, and that election won't be rigged. It'll be a fair and free election. And the latest opinion polls have Vice President Biden leading President Trump by 10%. I'm not getting partisan to say that I think, most people in Australia, certainly most people who follow these things closely, hope that we have a return to a more normal form of leadership. What do I mean by that? I mean an American president who defines American interest broadly, who understands that America first, always pressing every advantage that you have in every bilateral situation is actually not in America's broader interests over time, that it's more in America's interest to be a global leader, to be a rule maker rather than nickel and diming every negotiation. So I think that's important. I hope that America course corrects in November, but I will say it's hard to see America snapping back. And so I think it's incumbent on countries like Australia and India to say, well, what can we do, given that we probably will never have another unipolar moment. We'll never have a United States that is so capable and so willing to use its ability to provide sort of public goods to the international system. So what can we do? What can India and Australia do to invest in our own capacities, to invest in our defence forces, to invest in our diplomatic corps so that we can have more influence around the world? What can we do to thicken our relations with other countries? What can we do to expand our own minds? We often see ourselves as onlookers and cheerleaders. Navdeep might have seen this when he was High Commissioner. We often run ourselves down and we don't always see each other as other countries see us, which is not a global giant by any stretch of the imagination, but a significant country with a large economy, good diplomats, a good military, and a country that can make a difference in the world. We've got to see ourselves in that way. We've got to play in that, we've got to perform in that way because the Americans are not always going to be there to rescue us.
Oh, absolutely. So what do we do where the American leadership is kind of missing, and what are the choices left for India and America? And that also brings us to the question that would the emerging economies, be strong enough to be on their own, or would they need to choose sides? But I don't think we have so much time. I would like to move on to the bilateral and to the first virtual summit that's going to take place between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison. And Ambassador Suri, I would like to have your views on that, because this summit has been postponed for many inevitable reasons. And now it's finally taking place, and it's taking place at a time when both the countries are have plenty of economic concerns. What outcomes can we expect of this very important summit?
Well, as a former diplomat, I wouldn't speculate into what the agreements are that are going to be signed. But let me just say that beyond China, there is a very large bilateral agenda that impinges on our relationship. And one of the phrases that I hated when I was in Canberra was that the relationship has a lot of potential, because it really is time for us to start unlocking that potential. There are just so many areas in which we have natural complementarities. And one of the things that, I don't know whether Michael would agree, but usually in many cases you see the government behind the curve and usually the private sector leading. I think in the Australia-India relationship, you see the other way around. The government has actually been ahead of the curve. You mentioned to my friend Peter Verghese's excellent paper on the economic aspects of the relationship. And it's a case in point. He's telling you these are the opportunities that exist. But I think the private sector has been relatively shy and perhaps so seduced by the Chinese opportunity that they haven't quite looked at the Indian market with the same perseverance that it deserved. I think the Australian super funds, the Future Fund, for example, and some of the other super funds should be looking much more closely at the opportunities that India offers as a long-term investment destination. I believe that the progress that we are making in terms of our defense relationship needs to be expanded further, perhaps in terms of the kind of logistics agreements that we have signed with the United States and France as a case in point. We need to work much more closely on seeing whether in some of the high-tech niche areas in which Australian technologies are so strong, whether India offers an opportunity to scale up those technologies and really take them to markets. Because what I used to lament is that Australian universities do amazing research, but are very poor at marketing it into the global market. And perhaps there's a degree of convergence that we can that we can have there. And beyond that, into areas like agriculture, like mining, like cattle and dairy farming, etc. I used to look at we get seduced by the whole cricket metaphor, and it's great that we can have a conversation without referring to Sachin Tendulkar or Virat Kohli. We used to lament that everything goes down to cricket, which is wonderful, but there are so many substantive things that can make a difference to the lives of people. I know that the former Australian High Commissioner Harinder Sidhu made a big impact in some of these real areas, and High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell is equally committed to taking these forward. But there are a lot of substantive areas that we can build upon.
Michael, your comments on that. What are the substantive areas that, or what could be Australia's concern at this moment? Because what should be at the top of the agenda? Looking at the economy right now, which Australia is also facing unemployment and underemployment, must be big economic concerns. So what, according to Australia, would be the top priority now, and what is it expecting out of India?
Well, look, I'd agree with the list that that Navdeep mentioned. We better not talk about cricket, because then we will definitely go overtime on this call. I think we can certainly look to consolidating our defence relationships, and there might be ways that we can explore providing access to each other to some of our bases. I think having a discussion about issues like 5G and critical technologies is important. Australia and India are not completely on the same page there, but that's obviously an issue for the future, and I think we should talk about those things. I think generally having a kind of frank dialogue at the summit is very important. I was very disappointed when the bushfires meant that Prime Minister Morrison couldn't get across to India at the beginning of the year. But there's a lot to build on here. Navdeep mentioned the new High Commissioner, Barry O'Farrell, who's an old friend of mine, and he follows in the footsteps of a terrific High Commissioner. But Barry himself brings political heft as a former Premier of the largest state in Australia. That's quite unusual to send someone of that seniority on a diplomatic posting like this. And Barry's someone with a very long history of interest in India, as Navdeep knows. And also at the summit, there's obviously good chemistry between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison. And I don't know if either of you saw the tweet that Scott Morrison sent a couple of days ago, where he's a great aficionado of Indian cuisine, and he makes a mean curry, and he made some samosas, some vegetarian samosas, and he showed them on Twitter, and he called them scomosas, which is a play on the Australian slang ScoMo for Scott Morrison. So that's a nice level of warmth. I mean, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Morrison are not exchanging tweets like this at the moment. So there's warmth in the relationship, and Navdeep knows better than I that warmth goes a long way. It doesn't go all the way, and he's right. We need to focus on concrete outcomes to sort of unlock the potential he spoke about. But it's nice. It's a great start when you've got leaders who like each other and who want to do business with each other.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Yes, we all saw that tweet of the samosas and the mango chutney, which he very generously was willing to offer and share with Prime Minister Modi. But alas, this is just a virtual summit that's taking place. But there's a lot to build upon the relationship in India and Australia, and there's great chemistry between the two leaders. Thank you so much, Dr. Fullilove, for that conversation. And thank you, Ambassador Suri, for joining in today. And thanks to all of you for joining in this conversation at ORF.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.